Um, what?
Go.
Well, that was my question. Fine. What is something of the history of Vietnam?
Well, as World War II closed, Vietnam was part of an entity which I recognized as a child on a map as French Indochina. And that was a French colony. It was a time at which the countries that were dependent on European nations as being their owners, in essence, and their guides, were declaring and demanding their independence. French Indochina was part of that. There was a war going on there, and the war was to free the entire area from the French. And this was finally accomplished. Unfortunately, the leader of the forces that brought it about was Ho Chi Minh, who was a communist. And the result was that it was not going to be a favorable result as far as the United States is concerned, nor unfortunately for the people of the area. When the Battle of Dien Bien Phu was fought and the Ho Chi Minh forces were successful and the French were defeated, the nation, which was known previously as French Indochina and is shown here, was broken up into three countries. Vietnam was on the Pacific coast, Laos was on the interior, and Cambodia was on the seacoast and to the south. Vietnam was further divided into two separate entities. The south part of Vietnam was an ally of the United States. The north part of Vietnam was dominated by China and Russia, and they too were inimical towards each other. Uh, Fighting broke out, a continuation really of the war that had been fought against the French, but now it was being fought between the two Vietnams, North and South. As the fighting continued, it was largely on a guerrilla basis that the Viet Cong, which was the army of the North, would attack and then turn and disappear into the woods. And they would do what damage they could. They would take what supplies they were able to acquire, and they would leave and try to find themselves a haven where they could stay to regroup and rearm and make another attack. The South Vietnamese increasingly received aid from the United States, and their uh, army was dependent for ammunition, supplies, and weapons on the United States.
Okay.
Uh, how was the Vietnam War fought?
It was fought as a continuation, really, of the war against the French. The same tactics were being used by the Viet Cong, and that is that they would make sudden attacks on villages, on cities, on military installations, ammunition dumps, and try to get what supplies they could and then disappear into the jungle before the troops from South Vietnam or the troops from the United States could react and attack them. But the function of the United States Army was less vigorous than it has been in other battles, and that it came to be almost a 9 to 5 war where people could get up in the morning at a reasonable hour and go out on a patrol and try to destroy as much of the enemy as possible. And they would generally hope to be home by dark. And it was not the slog it out in the trenches 24/7 that was the basis for fighting World War I and World War II.
What was the draft and why was it important in the war?
As the number of troops that served in Vietnam constantly increased, it came to a point where there were not enough volunteers to keep the army up to full strength. The result of that was that a draft was initiated. Now, this is something that had been done before, all the way back as far as the Civil War. And in this case, the draft was set up on a numbers basis that everybody received a number according to their birthday. And if at the drawing that would be held, their birthday was the one selected, they were drafted. They had to report to the Army and receive training and face the fact that they were likely to be going over to Vietnam and participate in this war.
How was that draft won in the Vietnam War?
As I described, it was run as a lottery, and if your number came up, you would get a message from the Department of Defense, and it would tell you where to report and get your draft physical, and then you were sent to where you were needed.
What were people's response to the draft?
The war itself was never a very popular one. It was not a war that people saw either a great chance of winning or that they saw a great need to fight it. The concern from a military standpoint was that there were other countries in the region around Vietnam, that not only Laos and Cambodia, but that Thailand and what was then called Burma, but is now known as Myanmar, Malaysia, other countries, it was feared, would fall one after another if Vietnam fell into the hands of the communists. It was, in many people's point of view, vital to fight this war and to keep Vietnam on the side of the United States. In other people's opinions, it was, as I say, something unwinnable and unnecessary.
Were you drafted in the Vietnam War? Were you drafted in the Vietnam War?
I received my draft notice, but because I was working in an area that was important to the military, I was classified as defense essential, and I was not required to go. At the time, as a chemist, I was working with the synthesis of a series of organic compounds that were possible replacements for Agent Orange. As part of the war strategy, Agent Orange was a defoliant, and it was used to kill all of the plants and thereby clear the jungle so that we could see the enemy more clearly, we could find them. It was quite a poisonous material, and it was desired to achieve this with something less dangerous, and that was the basis of the project that I was working on. I was also testing electronic components for airplanes and helicopters. At the same time, I was also working on an anti-cancer project for the Mayo Clinic, so that all in all, the jobs that I had for the company that I was working for got me that classification. So as defense essential, I did not have to join the Army. I never went through any of the things that a lot of other people did. Incidentally, a couple of other ways that people went about avoiding the draft was, some of them simply and legitimately because they were too young or too old. Most of my cousins fell into that category. Another way was to stay in college and get a deferment from the draft, so that no, you don't have to go today, you have to go next year. But then they would find some way to stay in college and get that draft deferment extended. And so there was an awful lot of effort that went into staying out of the draft.
Did other people you know serve in the war?
Yes, they did. I had, as I say, I was amongst in my family, I was the oldest of the cousins, and many of them were simply too young to serve before the war started to wind down, so they never got drafted. And one of them in particular did go over to Vietnam, and his experience was that when he came to the end of his hitch, he was within 1 week of coming back home the bunker that he was in was hit by a mortar round, and his leg was shattered. And he did still come home, thank God, but he never walked exactly right again for the rest of his life. The other friend I had who was in the Army and who went and actually did 2 tours in Vietnam as a volunteer was an Army captain. And his first tour of duty he spent putting together the communication center at Da Nang in Vietnam. And his second tour of duty he was as the commander of a company of riflemen. And so he was in combat.